So welcome everyone to the Life-Saving Divorce Book Study, Chapter 9. I'm the author, Gretchen Baskerville, and I've been a Christian divorce recovery leader in churches since 1998, and no, I don't have any other life. So today we're discussing male victims of abuse and betrayal. Before we start, two things. I promise we'll have several polls, so get ready. And I want to remind you that next week is our last week, so do not miss it. We are talking about moving on in life after a life-saving divorce and finding self-respect, rejecting the shame, and living a satisfying, meaningful life, whether you choose to stay single or remarry. This is the chapter on healing after divorce. We discuss how to deal with anger at your ex, at yourself, and even anger at God. We discuss what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And we'll talk about trauma and PTSD. And as usual, we will debunk a lot of myths. For example, the myth that all divorcees are unhappy and miserable and bring all the same problems into their next relationship, which simply is not true. So my co-host today is Ginny. She's got the bright pink background. Ginny, wave and say hi.
Hi, good evening.
Thank you, Ginny. We're going to do something a little bit different tonight. Usually I give an overview and explain the chapter highlights, but for chapter 9, I've asked male survivors of abuse and betrayal to tell you their own stories. They definitely want to be heard. And if you think it's hard for us women to talk about abuse and betrayal, you should hear how tough it is for the men to speak up and for men to even be believed. Their stories are incredibly painful to listen to, but take heart. There is a happy ending in these stories. These men got to safety, have rebuilt their lives, and have happily remarried. So I am grateful for them coming back now, years later, and talking to us. But first, let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for your care and love for us and our children. We thank you for all the good men in our lives. We thank you that there are many models of love and commitment. And we thank you for these men who are willing to stand up and tell their stories. Lord, grant to each of us ears to hear, wisdom about our decisions, and fill us with peace, the peace that passes all understanding. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. In chapter 9, we read David's story, which was the horribly emotionally abusive story, and Gary's story, which was a combination of serial infidelity and gaslighting. And today we're going to hear Gary speak. But before we do that, I want to do a couple of polls. So here we go. All right. How much of chapter 9 did you get to read? A, the entire chapter. B, I started to read, but I had to stop because it was too emotional. C, I started, but I didn't have time to finish. D, I haven't started reading it yet. Or E, no, none. I don't have the book yet. Okay, and as you're voting, let me tell you a little bit about my own reaction to Gary and David's stories. Um, I intended originally for this book to be for women, believe it or not. And it was my husband who said, you really need to interview people from all over the world, uh, all different parts of the United States. You need to interview all different income, all different professions. You need to interview men and women, and you really need to understand because you're not necessarily representative, uh, being a white woman in Los Angeles, of what's going on in the rest of the country with life-saving divorces. So how are we doing on our poll? Anyway, I when I interviewed David, his story was so painful for me to hear. I couldn't sleep for the next 3 nights, and I eventually had to go talk to a counselor. So if you weren't able to read this entire chapter, I understand, and I can relate. Even my editor said that through the entire chapter, she kept hoping and praying that David and Gary would get to safety. So, okay, so where are we? So, 7 and 10 read the whole chapter. Yay! No one had to stop. Okay. I started, but didn't have time to finish. 1 and 4, I haven't started reading it yet. None don't have the book yet. Well, good. All right. So you've got the book. Excellent. Poll number 2. Before I read this chapter, and you can pick up to 2 choices. And by the way, this is completely anonymous. A, I thought men were unlikely to be abused. B, I had at least one male friend who was abused or cheated on. C, someone in my family was a male abuse or betrayal victim. D, I am or was a male survivor of abuse or betrayal. Or E, none of the above. And so getting to hear these stories was just powerful for me. And finally, I had interviewed many men actually for the book, but I finally decided we're going to do an entire chapter just for the men. And that's how chapter 9 came about. Okay, so let's take a look at the poll. At this point in the polling, we've got about 5% thought men were unlikely to be abused. About 1 in 4 of you said you've got at least one male friend who was abused or betrayed. Almost 1 in 3 of you said someone in my family was a male abuse or betrayal victim. 1 in 3 of you say I was or am a male abuse or betrayal survivor, and none of the above at 14%. So thank you so much for voting. Excellent. This is good to know. So the vast majority of you know that this can happen. And I think that's really important because men very much don't feel heard. So I want to introduce Gary. And we're going to hear Gary speak and tell us a little bit about his story. Ginny is going to unmute him. It starts on page 348 in your book. And I just think he's got some really important insights on all kinds of things, including good and bad counselors and how to deal with your anger at an unfaithful spouse. So go ahead, take it away, Gary. Tell us your story.
Okay. Um, I'm actually Lauren, but I want to let everybody know that that was completely my choice to reveal who I am. Gretchen is very considerate and professional with keeping things private and confidential. So if you talk to her with your own stories, you can anticipate that she will keep it very confidential and you will not be revealed. So this is entirely my own choice to do that. One thing I want to say right up front is that adultery in marriage is abuse. Okay, it's abuse. Abuse doesn't have to be, uh, domestic violence. Doesn't have to be financial. Doesn't have to be emotional. Adultery is abuse. First of all, it violates your marriage agreement. It totally devastates you emotionally. People who made promises to you are violating them in secret. It usually entails financial abuse. They're spending family funds on their affair partners. And very importantly, it's also can be devastating to your health. A lot of people, especially women, contract venereal diseases from their spouses who are having affairs, and leads to ovarian cancer and other issues. So this is not something to wave off or to uh, concentrate on forgiveness. This is very serious stuff, and you need to go into, if your marriage partner has been adulterous, that is abuse. That's about as serious as it comes next to domestic violence. Okay, so that's the starting point. And I didn't realize this. I was never told this by any pastor, by any of my Christian counselors. It was just one of those unfortunate things that happen sometimes in marriage. But it is definitely abuse, and it's taken me a long time and involvement and um, divorce recovery groups and study to learn this and for it to come home. So start right there. Okay. Um, so with myself, my own story is I was married for almost 20 years. Met my then wife in college. We hit it off very well. We had somewhat similar backgrounds in that our families were both Baptists, but she was still involved in the church. I wasn't. I saw too much growing up in my parents' conservative Baptist church, and in college I wanted nothing, zero to do with church and run away from it as best I can. Um, and we had it was kind of a up and down marriage. She was kind of a volatile person. Emotionally I wasn't used to that. My family is pretty much even keeled 24/7, 365, and like I said, our marriage was very was kind of up and down, and it would go from being passionate to being distant. And then we had a couple kids, which I really enjoyed, and she was a good mom. I was a good dad, and she got involved with them at a parent participation school and decided that she wanted to become a school teacher as well. So she went back to school. I supported her in that, and she got her teaching credential and started working student teaching and then a teaching job. And that's when things really started to change. I noticed that um, she really was out of patience with me all the time, frequently highly critical, sometimes to the point of being demeaning and abusive in her criticism. Um, and it even got to where my son, who I think was about 14 at the time, wrote her a letter to his own mother saying that why is she so critical of dad? I mean, she would do this at the dinner table. Um, you're just being mean. He doesn't deserve this. And he gave her the letter, and she read it and gave it to me and wanted me to punish him for writing this letter. And I just looked at her and said, no, it's all true. You are that way. And that was kind of a turning point. I started seeing that if my 14-year-old son is seeing this, I'm not entirely crazy. And I have to say that I wasn't a perfect husband. I think some people would say my emotional IQ wasn't very high. I hadn't had a lot of relationships with women before we got married, and I tend to be kind of avoidant. If you follow Enneagrams, I'm one of these weird people that's equally balanced between a 9 and a 5. And 9s are kind of avoidant. They tend to be avoidant, and 5s are analytic and want more information to solve problems. Yeah, that's me, both of those. So anyway, she stayed at the same school that she did her student teaching in, which I couldn't understand because she had the opportunity to work in our own school district with my kids were in. And this district that she stayed in had different holiday schedule and everything, so it made it awkward for vacations. The kids weren't out at the same time, and I couldn't understand why she would do it. Her district was low paying compared to others in the area. This is in Silicon Valley. I was in Santa Clara at the time, and but it's her career, and I just went with it. And then she changed schools, and then when she moved to the new school, she was telling me a lot of stories about how the other teachers are mean to her and say mean things, and it's not to be believed, and yada yada. And after a while, I got a phone call from somebody at her school saying that she and someone else were having sex at the school. And I'm like, yeah, you're just another one of those people that's persecuting my wife. I don't believe you. She wouldn't give a name or anything like that. Well, there was more odd and suspicious things that were happening. Sure, her psychological life was bad. She had a lot of depression. She was getting treatment for that, and she was on antipsychotic drugs. And eventually, it wasn't good. It just wasn't good. It was very volatile. It was like up and down, very attentive at times, and then very distant at other times. It was very hard to explain. And she she used to make up stories about me, or she would give motivations to me that didn't exist, that put me in a bad light. Like the classic one was, our neighborhood had an annual cleanup, and you could put things at the curb and they would haul it away. It was great. So we had this old screen door, security door, and I had replaced it, and I put it out at the curb. And the two of us were working in the front yard, and somebody came along and picked up the screen door and put it in the back of his truck. And she said, "Look, why did you throw that thing away? This guy is going to use it, and he's going to make sense of it. You're just wasting money." And I explained to her carefully. I said, "Look, the hinges on these doors are integrated right into the door, and the metal is all fatigued on these hinges, and you can't use it anymore. It's useless." She looked at me and said, "You're just saying that because he's Mexican."
Because he's Mexican.
He's Mexican, right? Out of the blue. I've never given her any reason to believe I was prejudiced against Hispanics, whatever. That's just totally bogus. But it was like part of a campaign. It just came out all the time that I was lazy. I had bad thoughts about people. And as I discovered later, this was all projection, because in fact, she was having multiple affairs going on. And, she had grown up as a good church girl and was very much in turmoil about being two-faced, in her life. And so she had to make me into a bad person in order to justify her own behavior. So eventually I got the "I love you, but I don't love you anymore" speech. And she wanted to get a divorce. And I was surprised. I mean, because again, like I said, we were up and down in our relationship quite a bit. But she wanted to be friends, and she wanted to have a collaborative divorce. And she said that she wanted for us to alternate weeks at home with our kids. Okay, I'm going to do this. This is just a way to get to the next step to where we can get back together again. So this went on for maybe a month or something like that. And sometimes we would trade cars. So one time after she was gone, or was my week with the kids, we traded cars, and I ended up with the car that she had. And I discovered a note in the car that she had left way down in a door pocket with an inventory of all the things that she wanted to take to a cheap motel with her boyfriend, like whiskey and sex toys and things like that. So that was pretty devastating. And then I happened to drive back home. I wasn't supposed to be home that week. I drove back home during the middle of the day and found her overnight bag with this inventory in it. So it was very clear that she was cheating on me. And we were doing some marriage counseling at the time. And so we met a couple days later, and I revealed all this stuff to her in front of the therapist that I thought was going to be the safest place. She turned beet red and then denied everything. Doesn't prove anything. It's not true. And so that was the end of that therapy. And we continued on alternating weeks for a while, until I realized that I was just her babysitter on the weekend so that she could go off with her boyfriends. And a friend of mine came over, and we took all of her clothing and furniture and stuff from our bedroom and put it in the garage. I was very good with it. Nothing was damaged at all. And then I put a lock on the bedroom door. So that was it. I'm not leaving. You're not using this bedroom. And And she came home from her weekend and saw this, and the kids were home, and even her mother was there, and she blew up and kicked the door down and trashed the room, and uh, and then called me, wanted to talk, and I didn't know all this stuff had happened. When I got there, I saw this. I don't know. It was like, wow, she's really losing it. Um, she tried to talk, and it wasn't worthwhile, and so she left. Um, and then the next day, I took photos of everything, and at this point, um, I had hired an attorney, and as it turns out, at the church I was attending at the time, one of the elders in the church was a family law attorney, and I hired him, and he was really good. And every time that we met, we would pray before we started, and he was very good at giving me direction. It was very realistic. So anyway, I took photos of all this, handed it to him. He said, "Okay, I'm going to get a restraining order. This is domestic violence." And so she got served and got removed from the house and lost temporary custody of the children for 90 days. And it really kind of put an end to her fantasy life that she was going through at the time. It didn't in, improve our relationship, which we thought it might as a shock to the system, but it didn't help. Um, so anyway, we went through quite a bit of stuff. I mean, I could go on forever, but she tried to force the sale of the house. She did force the sale of the house. Um, I was going to be financially able to buy her out, but she wouldn't let me have the house out of spite. I just wanted my kids to finish high school there, And so the house ended up being sold, but during the 30-day rescission period, 9/11 happened, and everybody thought the world was ending, and so they backed out of the sale. And then we went quite a while and couldn't get anybody to buy it. And then, things kind of changed. And at one point, she called me in kind of a miraculous way and said that she wanted to do some marriage counseling and try to reconcile. So I thought that was great. I thought that was an answered prayer. Probably was. I mean, how do you know? And we met with a therapist and who was really, really, really good. And one thing in my marriage that I always felt was that I never had an honest observer of what she said and did. Everything was like through her filter, right? And so finally, when we had a good therapist, she would, my ex-wife would say, "Well, I had to do this because he did this." And the therapist would look at her and said, "Did he put a gun to your head? Did he make you go out and have an affair? Couldn't you have made another choice? Why didn't you talk to a therapist and say, I'm really struggling with my marriage. We need to get in and do some serious work." She didn't like that at all. And so at one point, she was supposed to have broken all relationship or contact with this other guy. And she revealed that she didn't. And then she went through a couple of weeks just with the therapist herself alone. And then I was called back in and she said, well, she wanted to go ahead with the divorce. I said, great, get out. So she left and I sat down with the therapist and she told me, she said, Lauren, you dodged a bullet. This woman's got a lot of problems and you can't solve any of them. So,
Wow.
yeah. And she said, you're lucky, right? You saw this happen right here in this office and you know what her mental state is and how she thinks. So it was like really a turning point. Well, but the problem with that was that all along, the Christian therapist that I was seeing privately and the pastors that I was talking to were all assuring me that this marriage was going to get back together again, that God was going to work a miracle and that her heart would change if I would just pray and get lots of other people to pray. So now where was I? Somebody's not telling the full truth here.
Right, right. They want you
You
to stay and pray.
right. So there's different ways to look at this, right? When you're emotionally desperate and devastated, you need one of these life rings, like is in Gretchen's book. And so sometimes the optimism keeps you afloat, right? But eventually, you come to realize that no, it doesn't always work out like that. That people have a lot of free choice in the world and in this life, and that they can choose to do whatever they want, and they always have. And God's not able to control it. And if God controls everybody's actions and things on the basis of prayer, then God's got a lot of explaining to do because a lot of bad things happen. Eventually, I had gotten involved in divorce care groups, oddly enough, back in the conservative Baptist church that I rejected as a kid. And, but that was the only one locally that was offering them. So I was back there and really getting involved in divorce care and helping to lead it. I was, I was in it, I think 3 times there. Couldn't get rid of me. When I originally got the "I love you, but I don't love you" speech, we sat down with the kids and telling them we were working on getting a divorce and da 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 da. Well, everything that she told them was a lie. And when it became clear that that was true, with the advice of therapists and pastors, I sat down with my 2 sons who were, I think, 17 and 15 at the time, and told them, "No, this isn't right. Your mom's cheating. She has boyfriends, and that's why we're getting a divorce." And she totally blew up over that. And, this was child abuse and yada, yada. Not true. Kids need the truth. They need the information um, in an age appropriate way. I felt teenagers needed to hear that there's consequences to behavior. People don't get a divorce just out of fuzzy reasons. There's reasons for it. And divorce is usually a consequence of behavior. Um, it doesn't just fall out of the sky. And they need to know that. And I mean, for people who are going through this, you have to be smart about this. If you have a highly contentious divorce and there's, um, this whole issue of child alienation and things like that, this can be quite a serious matter. So um, you have to use your wiles about how you introduce this. Sometimes it's not appropriate all the time everywhere.
Yeah, you've got, I really have appreciated Lauren, Gary, that, you said I've got to tell my kids the truth. And yet I know, because we've talked a lot, that you actually wanted your sons to have a relationship with their mother, and that she's actually a pretty decent mother.
Yeah.
And you really encouraged that. And I think some people can do that, and some people, have such destructive spouses that they can't do that. But I really appreciated that about you, and I know it's a fine tightrope to walk.
Yeah. The thing is that most people that they're, even if they're adulterous or they're abusive in certain ways and they provoke a divorce or whatever, they're not all bad. Some are, but most people are not all bad. And you have to recognize that. I mean, in my case, my wife was a good mom, for the most part, and that she did a good job of raising the kids, and that professionally she's a good teacher and has earned a lot of respect for that. But I mean, our relationship is broken, and I don't want a relationship with her anymore. um, Other than in areas where it has to do with some kind of cooperation over the kids, which there isn't much. I mean, they're 37 and 35 now. So, although
Yeah,
one
they're
of
all
them just
grown
got,
up.
yeah, one of them got married a couple weeks ago, and it was interesting. I've gone through this before with going to weddings, and I'm pretty much at the meh stage of I don't really care very much. Not I'm not disrespectful to her or um, antagonistic or anything like that, but I'll conduct business with her, and then that's it. I don't need her in my life. I don't want her in my life. She's
Right.
toxic to me.
Well, thank you. I am very grateful for you telling your story, and it's really really powerful, and because so few men do step up and talk about it. And I know that you've told your story before because you've led divorce care quite a few times in your churches, and you've led also Henry Cloud Boundaries book studies as well. I want to talk a little bit about how often wives cheat, and this is a graph from let's see, how long a period is this? Well, from 1991 to 2010. So wives cheated about half the rate that men do. So about 22 of 100 men said they had cheated while married, and about 14 of 100 women said they had cheated while married. So it's a significant problem, right? So the other thing I wanted to talk about as we get into talking about John's story is what's even more prevalent is domestic violence. And in this case, we're going to look at figures that define that phrase as only contact sexual violence, stalking, and physical violence by an intimate partner. So that's a wife or an ex-wife, a girlfriend or an ex-girlfriend. And the diagram shows that about 1 in 4 women have been victims of intimate partner violence, and 1 in 9 men. And this is for the United States. And John, who's going to tell his story next, is from the UK. And there the numbers are about 1 in 6 men. So I also wanted to look over here on the right-hand side. What's really interesting is, according to the Centers for Disease Control, 1 in 2 men and women have experienced psychological aggression. And that's in the United States, and that's by an intimate partner during their lifetime. So right about 48% for both men and women. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I'm very honored to hear John's story. The longer version of John's story is on my YouTube channel. So my YouTube channel is under my name, Gretchen Baskerville, not under Life Saving Divorce. And in the long version of his story, there are links to several things: movie where there's been a reenactment of part of his story, and also for an excellent men's domestic violence organization called Mankind Initiative. And the links to that are in the show notes, but he also mentions it in this video. So we're going to hear from John. I've got him on a video here. Today we're talking about male victims of abuse and betrayal. Can you all hear that? Do good men get abused by their wives? Thank you. Yes, it happens. But men are much more likely to stay silent than women are, and much less likely to be believed. And that's why I'm grateful to John for allowing me to interview him. I appreciate his willingness to speak about these matters and give us a view into his life. So let's jump into this interview with John, where I ask him how he met his wife and what attracted him to her.
I signed up on a dating website for Christians, and the woman who was to become my wife read my detailed profile and contacted me. She was photogenic, but there was more to it than that. I didn't have any doubt about whether she would be interested in me, because she'd made the first contact. She was a bachelor's graduate from a respected Bible college, and she held a professional position in a healthcare setting. She offered spiritual and pastoral support, including counselling, to patients and their families at an incredibly challenging stage in their lives. I thought such a person would be easygoing, agreeable, and open to a range of outlooks on life. Both of us were in our 40s, and she told me she had met quite a few men, but had never been in a relationship for more than 6 weeks. She'd always been the one to end it, and she was still a virgin too. I thought, wow, no baggage. So here's a woman who's interested in me, and our profiles had both made it clear we were looking for a potential marriage partner. She knew I'd been divorced 12 years earlier. We spent almost every weekend together. seemed to get on very well, and we introduced one another to church friends and relatives. She seemed wonderful, everything went well, and we were married 9 months after our first meeting in person.
It all sounded so promising, didn't it, John? But I know that emotional abuse usually starts in pretty hard to identify ways. How did your wife start cutting you off from your friends and isolating you from supportive people? And what did you tell yourself that kept you in the relationship?
A few weeks into our marriage, we discussed having children. We'd only touched on that subject before, and I mentioned that the now adult foster daughter that I had from my previous marriage was the closest that I have to my own daughter. She seemed shocked, and I tried to explain how I'd known my daughter since she was 3, and that was over 20 years ago. I decided not to tell her that this young woman, who she had met several times, sometimes called me Dad. At our ages, there was no time to waste with trying to conceive. We had a lot of fun with that. Sexually, we'd decided to restrain ourselves somewhat prior to marriage, but once married, all that worked very successfully. We were completely compatible in that way. It was so reassuring because my first marriage had almost completely lacked significant sexual intimacy. I gradually discovered that my wife was against me maintaining past friendships. At first I thought it was only about women friends, and I was very clear that I would never insist on meeting a woman friend on my own. My wife would join us. When I received a wedding invitation from a long-standing male colleague, my wife asked me about the significance of the invitation. Why had we been invited? Why did I want us to go? This man had been a significant friend and colleague for over 15 years. My wife was opposed to either of us going, but she relented a few weeks before the wedding. I went along, but I felt distraught at going when I knew my wife had been opposed. I felt so bad about it, I felt so awkward there that I didn't even speak to the bride and groom. But they knew I'd been there because I'd left a present.
And that's just incredibly distressing, John. I mean, what woman wouldn't want her husband to attend the wedding of a long-time colleague and business contact? And yet, we've talked before, I know your story, and I know this is just the beginning of things she did to demean you. And one of those was the fact that you were a farmer. You had orchards, you had fruit, you were raising sheep, and it's shocking to me the stories you've told me.
She fed all the lamb to a colleague's dog. It was an insult, and I wondered what farmer, having grown a crop, would throw it all away. It made no sense at all. I felt so demeaned and devalued, and before we met, she'd read on my dating profile that I was a farmer. She knew exactly what I did. When I left school, I'd wanted to go into agriculture, forestry or engineering. By the time I met her, I was employed as a professional engineer, and at home I was a small-scale farmer who'd planted a new wood. I'd achieved all 3 ambitions. Having my wife devalue and disrespect what I did, when she knew about it well before we were married and from that profile, along with her insisting that I was not properly valued in my work either, felt so demeaning. She would assert that she was a better judge of people because she had a better upbringing and because of her professional role. She even had a nickname that implied she was of very high standing in society. I ignored that possible red flag, but some friends later told me they noticed it. She claimed I was not sufficiently respected at work and deserved a job with better compensation. I was happy in my work, I was a professional engineer, and I had no wish to change. She would demand I apologise for things for which there was no reason to apologise, like her waking up while I was driving in the car in an appropriate manner along a bendy road, lightly accelerating and using the brakes. If I didn't apologise, she would lecture me and tell me that she was brought up to apologise. She'd do her best to provoke me and get me to argue. Then she told me she was telling a counsellor colleague about my inappropriate behaviour. It was just so confusing. Do you know, she even criticised me for being English. It sounds silly, but it's the extent to which people go sometimes. She was of a different nationality and she had books about the idiosyncrasies of the English. She used them against me in an unpleasant manner, and an American friend noticed and asked me how I coped with that. That American friend was in fact a personal counsellor.
So even your personal friends were noticing her treatment of you. And that's really distressing. And it distressed them so much, they pulled you aside and said something about it. Now, how did your wife treat your foster daughter?
A long time before I met my wife, when my foster daughter was 19, we had a discussion about relationships. I told her that if she wanted, when she married, I'd be happy to walk her down the aisle. My wife asserted her professional experience, claiming she was a better judge of people than me, and she knew my foster daughter's family would hate me for walking her up the aisle. So, as instructed, I contacted her real father, who I already knew had no interest in attending the wedding at all. He confirmed that he wasn't wanting to attend the wedding, and he was quite happy for me to see his daughter up the aisle. My wife, though, was still opposed, and she told me a brother should do it. So I checked that out. But my foster daughter didn't want to do that. She said, "They're my brothers. I don't want them to walk me up the aisle." It dragged on for some time. Eventually, I think the groom must have intervened. I didn't know him very well at that stage. He and my foster daughter just had no knowledge of why I'd become so reluctant, and they weren't to get to know until my own marriage ended.
You know, John, it must have been horrible to disappoint your foster daughter and feel you could say nothing and make no explanation. Here we often say, happy wife, happy life. It's a message that says as long as the husband agrees to everything his wife wants, the family will be happy.
We had so many differences of opinion, and I wasn't allowed to pull away from disagreements. I had to accept what she said. When things got too difficult, which was regularly, eventually I'd back out, walking away. She stopped me going out, claiming she feared I might come to some harm because of my state of mind, that she insisted I was in a poor state of mind. She would stand blocking the front door to prevent me leaving. She was incredibly confrontational and told me any attempt to move her so I could escape was me being abusive to her. So my only option in these situations was to make a sudden sort of run for it when she wouldn't expect it. But then we went to couples counsellors, and she got these counsellors. They agreed that I would stay in the house, and I very reluctantly consented. I felt I had no choice. So to get any peace, I had to suddenly run up the stairs into a bedroom, often grabbing a laptop on the way so I could make notes in a journal. I'd put a chair against the door, and she would taunt me to come out.
I mean, the idea, John, that your wife felt she was entitled to have things her way, that she would physically block you and could enlist professional counselors to side with her, must have made you feel incredibly trapped.
I was married to a woman in a highly respected professional position, which included the public expression of Christian ministry. She would tell me she could do whatever she liked to me, that I could do nothing about it, and she ridiculed me when I pointed out that her sustained attempts to deprive me of sleep were torture. I didn't always respond especially well, but when you're deliberately sleep deprived by your abuser, who'll not let you go to bed, deliberately wakes you up and picks on you whenever you're ill and can't concentrate well enough to complete a sentence properly, it becomes extremely difficult. I just couldn't think straight. I was always reminded about those times when I'd not responded very well, and I don't ever recollect her accepting responsibility for her own behaviour. She was deliberately provoking me. I felt trapped, unable to seek help. Gradually, the abuser gains power and control over their victim, whose self-esteem becomes very low. I was aware that battered men are frequently laughed at and ridiculed, and often assumed to be the perpetrator.
Absolutely. We have such a double standard about abuse, and it's just assumed that only women are abuse victims. And we know that's not true. I want to highlight a few things in your story. You mentioned sleep deprivation, which is one of the worst kinds of abuse, and yet one we never talk about. People ask me, why do victims stay so long? And you said it perfectly. The abuser's power over the victim increases because the vulnerable spouse's self esteem declines to the point where they no longer feel they deserve any decent treatment. I'm always interested in finding out how the victimized spouse finally wakes up and sees reality. You had an old friend who was a domestic violence advocate, and she opened your eyes to the truth. Tell us about that.
She was the person my wife was most determined to keep me away from, and she checked my emails to ensure we were not in contact. One morning I felt an urgency to contact her. It would not go away. We arranged to meet that day. I believe it was God's guidance. I'd completely forgotten about my friend's domestic abuse advocacy, but she told me, "You're experiencing the classic cycle of domestic abuse," and she drew an elementary Duluth wheel. I didn't know it was called that at the time. It explained the patterns of behaviour between me and my wife, her isolating me so much that I had little support, minimising and demeaning me and asserting her professional credentials and upbringing, denying that her behaviour was in any way abusive and blaming me for any response of mine that was only me trying to cope with her abuse. It helped confirm that my wife was doing her very best to portray me as her abuser. I realised I was being exploited in many ways. She had told me she was telling a personal counsellor at work about my behaviour, and that she could do whatever she liked. I could do nothing about it. A few hours later, I read the official definitions of domestic abuse on the website of Mankind Initiative, and I read some other men's stories. As I began to properly recognise that so much of what she'd done to me was domestic abuse, I wept and wailed loudly. It was just such an incredible shock to actually read it, to see it there, and realise that it had happened to me.
As you're telling your story, I just get this deep, visceral response to what happened to you, that cry from the depths of your being. And all of us who've been through intense betrayal or abuse have that moment when we finally realize what was done to us.
I still find myself occasionally being cruelly challenged as a perpetrator. I don't recollect church-based accusers ever inviting me to tell them about the abuse or to offer any evidence. They simply attack me.
Now I want to change the topic completely to something a bit more happy. Many abuse victims have been told that they attract abusers, that it's a problem within themselves, and so they're afraid to ever date again. But you are now happily remarried. I want to know, tell us your secret. How did you approach the dating scene and determine how to navigate it?
When my wife started divorce proceedings, I realised it was best to move on. Before I met her, I'd been in a relationship that was not in the slightest way abusive. We'd decided to part because I felt I should marry a Christian woman. I think it was that prior positive experience that gave me the confidence to move on. I signed up on a dating site that was very selective. I could only see my matches, and the only women that could see me were ones that were matched up with me. I went on a few dates, and it helped me realise I had not been the problem, and most women are not abusive. It helped me build some confidence in myself. I spent a very long time finding out about the woman who became my new wife. It took me a very long time before I could talk with her in detail about my experiences. The woman who became my new wife is utterly different to my abuser. We support one another in so many ways. Life has its challenges, but she loves helping me in the woodland, and she grows most of the crops herself.
You know, I just want to stand up and cheer for you. I'm so excited for you and your wife. Now, let's pivot And I want you to speak to men directly. What do you want them to know about male victims of abuse? Why do they stay? What does it mean? Does it mean they're less of a man? And where should they go for help?
Men, if you think you're in immediate physical danger, get out of there and contact the police. That's important. You need to look after that safety, your own safety. If not, search out an organisation that states specifically that it helps male domestic abuse or domestic violence victims. The best ones often have men's stories on their websites. So if you wonder whether what is happening to you is abuse, check them out. Many men do this very secretively, searching online when no one will know they're doing it. Often national organisations, like the Mankind Initiative in the UK, which is mankind.org.uk, can direct a man to other support nearer to his home. Men stay primarily because they fear losing contact with their children, or they fear their children will be abused, and not being with them, they can't provide protection. This is a sign of your strength. You're not weak in dealing with this and admitting that domestic abuse has happened to you. It happens to some very strong men. In fact, I can think of various men from the army veterans, and actually men currently in the army who've experienced domestic abuse. It was tough for them to speak up about it. Men often have a very strong commitment to their marriage, so many are not quitters who walk away from their responsibilities easily. Often they've been controlled so much that they feel they cannot seek help, and they often fear they will be seen as the abuser. The authorities are gradually getting a better understanding of male domestic abuse victims and how to help them. But an organisation that you speak to that specifically helps male domestic abuse victims will be able to help give you some guidance on that.
John, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for educating us. I pray your story will give hope and insight and empathy to other men who've experienced this. And I just wish you the best as you advocate, as you speak out, and as you show other men that there is life after an abusive marriage. So to hear John's entire story, go to my YouTube channel, Gretchen Baskerville, my YouTube channel, and he'll talk to you about how he got questioned by the police after his wife made false allegations of abuse, and how that went. A very, very powerful story. Anyway, let's look at some takeaways from men's stories. I mean, what we see for the man is the same thing we women see, that there are just some people who are too self-absorbed or too destructive to even be marriage material, yet no one ever told us that. Abusers often cross your boundaries and demand you violate your view of right and wrong. In the case of John, it would have been a morally right thing for him to walk his foster daughter down the aisle. Marrying a Christian is not an automatic guarantee of a good spouse and a healthy marriage. People who love to argue and manufacture conflict for no good reason, can be very destructive. And then standing in your way, waking you up in the middle of the night for no good reason, coercing you to stay in your room or home, are all covert physical abuse examples. And if you look at chapter 4 in my book, you'll remember there were 130 examples of various kinds of abuse and neglect. And then isolating you, keeping you from contacting friends, hacking your email, making false accusations or threats. That's also abuse. And by the way, in the United States, hacking emails is a felony level crime. And then a chronic pattern of belittling, criticism, blaming, telling you that their punishment of you is for your own good. These are all examples of emotional abuse. I mean, if your spouse is unhappy with you, why don't they leave you, as Gary said? And then finally, some counselors are good, but others just hold out false hope and keep telling you to try harder, minimize your anger, pressure you to reconcile without any evidence of long-term change from your spouse. And then lastly, something that Gary's story had brought up, anger is really important and very necessary response to marriage endangering sins such as abuse and betrayal. And you can use that anger to motivate you to leave if that's what you choose. Don't just sweep that under the carpet and feel that you have to get rid of that as quickly as possible. That is God's protection of you. All right, so we're going to do a group discussion, and here's how we do it. If you want to share, please unmute yourself. So question 1, Gary, John, and David's stories detail abusive and destructive marriages. Share which story you relate to and why. Question 2, if you used to be skeptical that men could be abused, what has changed your mind over time? Question 3, if you're a male survivor of abuse or betrayal, or no one, what is one thing you'd like to share? And question 4, if you were raised by a narcissistic or destructive mother, how did that shape your view of male victims of abuse? Thank you so much, everyone. I want to talk about next week because it's chapter 10. It's our last week, and it's on moving on and finding happiness again. There is a ton of good news in this chapter. The highlights are, if you've ever thought, I've got that black cloud over my head, I've got the red D for divorce on my forehead, I'll never be happy again, no one will ever love me again, this chapter is for you. And if you ever wonder if, you've messed up your life forever, or you've missed God's plan A and plan B for your life, and you're somewhere way down at plan ZZ, this is your chapter. And if you feel like you're now disqualified from ever serving God again, and that's what I thought, that just broke my heart, this chapter is for you. And I think there's just a lot of good news. And so I need for you all to take the survey because it's important. I'm going to use the survey results from tonight when we go into chapter 10. And now let's look at the journaling prompts. If you like to journal, we've got 4 different prompts for you. You can pick and choose or take on all of them. Here's the first one. From hearing these stories from men, I'm going to share this with my son and other young men I know. I don't know about you, but believe me, I've had this conversation with my son. Similar to the men in this chapter, I've developed boundaries by I will be more supportive to men who would endure abuse and betrayal from now on by, and with regard to the recovery industrial complex, this is the humorous phrase used for never-ending weeks and weeks and weeks of counseling that never result in any improvement. I no longer feel I must keep trying just because my church or counselor tells me to, because now I realize blank. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to leave these journaling prompts up for another couple of minutes. But thank you for coming, and this is the end of our meeting. See you next week.